Welcome back. I will keep the screen black to not interrupt your sleep. Let's get to it. So tonight we are talking about medieval prison guards. Medieval prison guards worked in cold stone prisons, surrounded by desperate men with nothing to lose. You had power, yes, but not without cost. How do you enforce punishment without becoming a target yourself? And what's the one mistake that could turn your life into a prisoner's revenge story? Imagine stepping into work knowing the sounds of desperation will follow you everywhere. The scrape of chains on the ground, the echo of muffled shouts, and worst of all, long, enduring silence from behind those heavy wooden doors. This isn't a place where anyone thrives. It's where life stagnates, rots, and waits. And yet, here you are, holding the keys to it all. As a medieval prison guard, your job isn't just locking people away. You're not just a gatekeeper. You're the barrier standing between chaos and the outside world. Keeping order in a prison wasn't a peaceful task, and it certainly wasn't predictable. Every day demanded your vigilance. It meant enduring the sights, sounds, and smells of people crammed into dark, airless cells, with no guarantees that they wouldn't try to pull you into their fight to escape, or their fight to survive. Strong stomach? You'd need it. Steady nerves? Mandatory. Once that heavy door shuts behind you, it's not just the prisoners trapped inside, it's you too. Let's set the scene. Medieval prisons weren't built for anyone's comfort. Not the prisoners, not the guards. Forget clean floors or bright rooms. The air was damp, heavy with the stench of human waste and unwashed bodies. Rats skittered through the cells, feeding off scraps, both food and, in worst cases, flesh. The walls, rough and cold stone, dripped with condensation. The lack of ventilation created an oppressive, suffocating heat in summer and a bone-biting chill during winter. And you're here, pacing, day after day, keeping watch among sick, desperate people who'd risk everything to exchange your role for theirs. You'd often be stationed alone at the entrance or along the corridors, perhaps with a wooden club as your only tool for defense. A sword? Only if you're lucky, or the prison is particularly high profile, but most likely you're holding something as basic as an iron-tipped rod. It feels flimsy in your hands when compared to the number of prisoners packed into the cells and cages around you, and there's no radio, no relief patrol, just a button away. If something goes wrong, and it often does, it's up to you to fix it, or to survive long enough to find someone who can. The physical setting might seem bad enough, but here's the harder truth. The prison itself could feel like more of an enemy than the people you were guarding. Disease, for one, was a constant, invisible threat. Rats and fleas carried sickness that would spread in the cramped quarters, and the guards weren't immune. You worked in proximity to infections like plague, dysentery, and typhus, with no real concept of how these diseases spread or how to avoid them, just being in the same foul air as the prisoners placed you at risk every single day. And then, there was the constant question, what kind of guard will you be? Medieval prisons didn't operate with the same strict codes or rules you might imagine in more modern systems. Your job wasn't necessarily to maintain justice, it was to maintain control. There were times when you had to decide on the spot, was a punishment deserved, or were you overstepping? Many guards struggled with this blurred line, while others exploited it. After all, maintaining power in such a role could also mean taking liberties with it. But too much force, or the wrong target, and you might find yourself the victim of revenge, turning you from the guard to the guarded in a blink. Still, the prisoners you oversaw were far from powerless, even behind bars. Many were criminals with lives shaped by desperation. Some were there for petty thefts, surviving off scraps like stray dogs. Others had committed crimes of violence and wouldn't hesitate to follow through if given the chance. There were prisoners locked away for political reasons or debts unpaid, but here, all of that fades to basic truths. You were the one thing standing between them and freedom. And for those with nothing left to lose, why wouldn't they try to tip the scales? Now, some of the most chilling stories from medieval prisons come from what you didn't see coming. Guards on duty often spent moments in tense, eerie quiet, moments that might lull less cautious individuals into a state of comfort. But a sharp ear and sharp instincts were your armor. The dim light down long hallways meant shadows played tricks on your eyes. Silence wasn't safety, it was foreboding. And here's the thing, the daily patience and stamina you needed wasn't the most thankless part of the job. It was the constant knowledge that the delicate power you held could be shattered the moment something went wrong. To stay even a step ahead in this environment required you to become part mind reader, part soldier, and part survivor. Guards were sometimes tasked with enforcing harsh punishments, ranging from administering beatings to overseeing grueling public executions. Though, in theory, you were fulfilling justice, what passed as justice in medieval times wasn't always straightforward. For prisoners, punishments could also feel like retaliation or cruelty, and guards often bore the brunt of this retaliation once carried out. Were you too lenient? Maybe you'd lose respect or control. Too harsh? You risked becoming an enemy in the eyes of prisoners or even the broader population. Even still, with all the risk, your power over the prisoners gave you some leverage, even if it was paper-thin. Handing out enough punishments to keep order without spiraling into cruelty was a balancing act, and for many guards, skewing too far to either side of the spectrum could lead to disaster. The role demanded you exercise authority while hoping, praying you didn't end up in over your head. A medieval guard's job wasn't just punishing prisoners or locking doors. It was a constant game of observation and preparation, knowing that any slight misstep, a single forgotten detail, might cost you. A key left slightly ajar, a window overlooked during checks, a fight allowed to spiral because you hesitated too long. In moments like these, the balance between authority and survival tipped rapidly against you. Your maneuvering didn't always stop trouble, either. Guards were occasionally targeted by prisoners who had nothing to lose. A prisoner might bribe a guard to look the other way, then threaten to expose him for corruption unless he allowed something worse, a jailbreak, weapons being smuggled in. Suddenly, your power is a noose tightening around your own neck. You hold the keys, but they weigh heavier than anything else in the prison. And yet, amid all of this, you could never just assume you were completely in charge. Physical attacks, revenge plots, and constant manipulation filled your hours as much as dragging food down dim corridors or dragging prisoners up ancient staircases. The job called for all the strength you could summon mentally and physically, while asking for something more unspoken, resilience. You didn't just need to survive the prisoners or the powers above you, you had to survive the prison itself. The sharp irony here? As in charge, as you might feel, some of the best guards were those who understood just how vulnerable their position really was. A chain only holds if every link does its part. But as a medieval guard, one weak link, one moment of fatigue, trust, or just bad luck, and suddenly, you weren't the one in control anymore. Between the unsympathetic stones of the prison and the people behind those bars, this was no career for a faint heart or a weak mind. Welcome to medieval justice, if you can keep it under control. But how do you manage a group of prisoners who not only outnumber you but often have more motivation to escape than you do to catch them? Now, that's where the job required more than just a set of keys. Your day starts with a sound that wakes you like a slap, clinking chains, blocked by the thick doors you're about to unlock. It rings out in uneven patterns, some prisoners shifting where they lay, others pulling at the iron shackles bolted to the cold stone walls. You inhale and immediately regret it. The air is damp, heavy, and laced with the unmistakable stench of decay. Welcome to your shift. The first task? Bring a little order to the chaos. Your keys jangle as you move from cell to cell, checking locks, securing bolts, and occasionally dodging the wild reach of an angry prisoner's arms. Locked doors are your best friend here. They're the only thing keeping you in charge of this mess. If you've been assigned to check the stocks or the pillories in the courtyard, that adds another layer to your morning as you brace for whatever insults, or worse, get hurled your way from the prisoners on display outside. Food delivery comes next, though food is something of a stretch. Grubby wooden bowls filled with the kind of watery stew that could pass for broth, or at least water-stained by sitting next to actual meat, are brought in for the prisoners' mealtime. Bread is a luxury you won't hand out often, and there's no such thing as a dietary plan for the incarcerated. If they can swallow it, that's good enough. Some prisoners are considered so dangerous or combative that their meals have to be slid through narrow slots. And then there are times the food itself becomes a weapon, bowls flung back through the bars, stale hunks of bread hurled at you out of spite. It's not just degrading to them, it's demeaning for you. But you press on. It's hard to argue hygiene or full bellies when most here would be on their knees for a chance at survival, rotting floors and all. Between feedings, you're inspecting areas of the prison for damage. The environment here takes as much from you as the job itself. The walls, wet with moisture seeping through the stone, crack under their own weight. Wooden supports weaken over time. Braces for doors or bars rust until all that's left are brittle orange stains on your hands. Your job is simple. Make note of anything that might collapse, preferably before it decides to. These inspections are tedious, sure, but neglect them, and you might find yourself responsible for a prisoner escaping through a hole in the crumbling wall or the collapse of an entire cell. Worse, you'll be blamed for it, no questions asked. But if only things were as straightforward as checks and feeding rounds. No, the atmosphere here means you must also act as keeper of peace and fights. All it takes is one prisoner, often the loudest one in a cell overcrowded with 6 or 8 bodies, to start throwing punches over a scrap of bread or the lean-to corner in the cell that's marginally drier. Breaking up fights isn't a rare occurrence. It's as routine as breathing. Sometimes you wade in swinging your club, knowing full well you might accidentally strike someone you don't intend to. And sometimes there isn't space or time for fairness. You just fight until the chaos settles. Other times, you might try reasoning with angry prisoners, but let's be honest, it rarely works. Most of these people have seen enough violence that the threat of punishment doesn't scare them. You might get compliance now and then, but don't fool yourself into thinking you have their respect. And then there are the high-stakes days, the ones that stick with you far longer than they should. Preparing a prisoner for public execution isn't just grim, it's complicated. You're removing someone from the prison who, in all likelihood, has nothing to lose anymore. Shackles go on tight, keys are triple-checked, and all eyes stay on the condemned as you escort them toward the gallows or whatever brutal justice the crowd has come to see. In some cases, you're tasked with securing the ropes or fastening the chains used in their execution. The weight of this task doesn't hit all guards the same way. For some, it's just another duty, easy enough to do and forget. For others, it lingers, especially if the prisoner's crime wasn't all that clear, or they begged for mercy in a way you couldn't ignore. Your surprise duties don't end there. As a guard, you're also expected to play the role of a record keeper, a critical part of your job, even if no one mentions it much. You'll spend parts of your shift marking down prisoner names, crimes, and sentences. If someone dies during the night or has fallen sick, it's up to you to log the details. Forgetting or mishandling these types of documents could lead to major blowback. A missing record might mean a prisoner's conviction is questioned or even overturned. And guess who gets blamed? You. The catch? Most guards wouldn't have much formal education or even know how to write fluently. You'd copy what you were told as best you could, relying on memory for the details and hoping no one picked apart your work too harshly later. This juggling act turns your days into an exhausting blur. The monotony of rounds and bowed heads can lull you into a false sense of routine. But that's a mistake. This environment doesn't allow for mindlessness, even on what looks like a tame day. One lazy moment, leaving a lock untested or failing to report a cell break, and suddenly, routine becomes utter chaos. A loose prisoner doesn't just threaten escape, they threaten you. If someone slips out and the other inmates notice, they'd see their moment to strike. A bungled escape is their signal to overpower you or rip the keys from your unconscious hands. And it's not just about brute force. Take bribery. Guards who grew too complacent were easy prey for prisoners with outside connections or a secret stash of valuables. A coin here, a promise there, and you could find yourself dangerously compromised. A bribe sounds tempting until it's leveraged against you, requiring more favors or unleashing more suspicion. Refusing it outright sounds noble, sure, but winning praise won't matter much if someone then decides to make an example of your principled stand. The daily grind alternated between drudgery and dread, with no clear line where one ended and the other began. Yes, there were dull stretches spent patrolling the same halls of cells, staring at the backs of prisoners who stayed silent. But even then, you had no way of knowing who might suddenly snap. Today's quiet inmate could be tomorrow's escape artist, and letting your guard down, even for an instant, was something only the reckless or the arrogant did. Either mistake could get you killed. This is why meticulousness wasn't just praised, it was survival. A key misplaced meant an easy entry point for rebellion. A lock overlooked could mean prisoners gearing up for violent retaliation as soon as an opportunity arose. Sometimes, it wasn't just your life on the line. It was the entire prison's tenuous order. The chain of command between guards couldn't handle too many oversights before buckling, and orders rarely came with much clarity or concern for your safety. Every task you performed, mundane or life-threatening, carried the weight of someone else's expectations sitting uncomfortably against zero room for error. Of course, preparation could only take you so far. There were risks no amount of diligence could protect you from, hazards that came from walking into the paths of those who had nothing left to lose. Do your job, feed the prisoners, and log your records all you want, but even a perfect guard was never truly safe. Your work handed you keys, not invincibility, and every step of your day was a reminder of just how thin the line between order and disaster really was. And then there were the risks no amount of preparation could prevent. When your workplace is packed with people who've lost everything, it's not a question of if danger will come meets when. Sure, the locks are strong and the walls are thick, but they don't fix the one constant of medieval prison life: the boiling mix of fear, anger, and desperation behind those bars. Every clank of a chain or glance through the ironwork is a reminder that you're outnumbered. If you make one mistake, you won't be walking out quietly. And here's the thing, it wasn't just the prisoners that made the job dangerous. The dungeon, the cells, even the air itself seemed to conspire against you. Overcrowded cells weren't rare, they were the standard. Imagine a space barely big enough to hold 3 people, now jammed with 5 or 6. Add the fact that hygiene wasn't exactly a medieval priority, and you get conditions ripe for the spread of disease. Typhus, dysentery, influenza, whatever illness one prisoner caught, it quickly became the cellmate's burden too. Unfortunately, you weren't exempt. Breathing the same air, touching the same surfaces, and handling food deliveries meant you were just as vulnerable to the outbreaks that occasionally swept like wildfire through the prison walls. There are records of entire dungeons falling victim to sickness, not just prisoners. Guards were buried alongside them. You might think keeping your distance would help, but that was a luxury you rarely had. Physical closeness to the inmates wasn't optional. You had to unlock doors, deliver food face to face, and sometimes drag prisoners from one miserable spot to another. Each encounter came with risks that were hard to predict but always present. Take someone condemned to death. A regular face in dungeon SWAT, motivation do they have? Not to try something. They've got nothing to lose, after all. That's where things often escalated, fast. Furious outbursts, sudden attacks, or coordinated efforts from multiple prisoners turned mundane moments into dangerous ones. You'd go from carrying bowls to dodging stones or fists in seconds. And when the prisoners don't care about consequences, every interaction with them feels like walking a blade's edge. Being outnumbered made all of this worse. Guards weren't stationed shoulder to shoulder, not in most cases. Staffing was thin, either because of budget constraints, mismanagement, or the simple assumption that a strong lock was enough. You'd be patrolling alone more often than not, armed with little more than a wooden club or metal rod. Forget suits of armor or heavy weapons. Dungeons weren't designed to defend you. If things went sideways, you'd better hope you were either fast enough to escape or lucky enough that help was nearby. History, though, suggests it often wasn't. And those odds stacked heavily against you didn't go unnoticed by the prisoners. They saw the exhaustion in your face, the lapsing attention during long shifts in dim corridors, and they learned to exploit it. Revenge was always a possibility, especially for inmates who felt unfairly punished or treated harshly. Take the case of one 14th century guard in a French dungeon who earned a reputation for cruelty. He was ambushed by prisoners during a routine feeding round, beaten unconscious, and left for dead. By the time backup arrived, several prisoners had escaped through the door. He'd failed to relock, a mistake that likely cost him his life in more ways than one. But not all threats came from blatant acts of rebellion. There was a subtler, colder kind of danger: manipulation. Prisoners weren't stupid, and desperation could sharpen their cunning. Some might try bribery, offering stolen goods or a promise of wealth if you'd let them get away with just one infraction. Others tried befriending guards, acting subdued and trustworthy for weeks or months, only to exploit that familiarity with a sudden attack or escape attempt. And if a guard fell for a bribe or started bending the rules, they could end up trapped in a web of blackmail. One favor led to another, until suddenly the person holding the keys wasn't the one in control anymore. While there's no shortage of stories about prisoners targeting guards, there are also accounts of creative ways guards tried to protect themselves. In some cases, they'd claimed the upper hand by creating clear but ruthless power dynamics. Public displays of punishment were one way to warn inmates not to cross the line. Guards were known to stage beatings in front of others, or carry out punishment in ways that left psychological scars, not just physical ones. It was grim work, but to them, it wasn't cruelty, it was insurance. A prisoner too afraid to attack you is still alive, yes, but less likely to try anything foolish. But that approach, while effective for some, came with its own risks. Push too hard, and you might incite a riot. There's a historical account from England where a dungeon guard's decision to execute harsh punishments backfired spectacularly. He became the enemy of the entire prison, and it only took one moment of complacency for the prisoners to group together and overpower him. Worse, Some prisoners weren't in for solitary crimes or petty thefts. They were part of wider communities, families, or gangs outside the prison who might take issue with how their associate was treated. Punishing the wrong person in the wrong way could mean carrying a target on your back long after they were released. Not surprisingly, all these layers of danger forced guards to adapt in ways that might seem, at best, inventive. Some kept trained dogs nearby, using them as both alarms and attack animals in case a prisoner got close. Others began crafting makeshift armor out of leather or scraps of metal nothing that would slow them down, but enough to block stabs from a shiv or blunt the impact of a slingshot stone. Patrolling at night became an art in itself. Guards would tread lightly, listening for even the faintest rustle, avoiding areas where shadows might make them easy targets. Some were known to carry torches not just for sight, but to brandish as weapons in narrow spaces. After all, fire was a language everyone understood, but no amount of cleverness erased the realities of the job. You held the authority, sure, but you were far from invincible. One bad interaction, one moment of weariness on a long shift, and suddenly that authority could vanish. If a prisoner got hold of your keys or worse, there was nothing stopping them from shifting the balance in their favor. The keys that symbolized your power, they could just as easily become your downfall. Because of all this, guards existed in a liminal state ultimate dominance over prisoners, but constantly teetering on the edge of danger. You might walk through the cells one day unscathed, untouched, and almost bored. But that could flip instantly with one snapped insult, one desperate action from a prisoner who wanted to see their family one last time, or one small oversight on your part. You weren't just guarding lives, you were guarding your own. Every crack in the wall, every look from a prisoner who didn't quite seem as defeated as you hoped, was a possible moment of chaos waiting to happen. So yes, guards could enforce punishment and stomp out disorder, but survival meant knowing where to draw the linear, at least how to balance authority without tipping into cruelty. Which begs the question, what happens when that line disappears and you're the one expected to deliver justice? Could you cross that boundary, knowing it might come back to haunt you? Or does the job break something in you before you even realize what's happening? Well, that's where things get messy. The line between justice and cruelty? In medieval prisons, it was often as thin as the leather on the end of your whipper, the flat side of your wooden stick. If you were a guard, you likely carried an air of authority in one hand and punishment in the other. The question wasn't whether you could hurt a prisoner, it was how far you could go before things got out of hand. And where that line fell depended less on rules and more on who was looking, or not looking. Medieval prisons didn't run on handbooks or employee training seminars. There wasn't a list of acceptable punishments nailed to the walls of the guardhouse. Instead, authority was often left up to the guard, their mood, and the vague boundaries dictated by whoever held the local power. A sheriff might tell you to keep order. A castle lord might demand you make an example. What those meant was entirely up to interpretation. But make no mistake, your authority as a guard was as much about intimidating the prisoners as it was about keeping them behind those bars. Now, let's be clear. Not every punishment was about beating someone senseless, though. Yes, there was plenty of that if you were the kind of guard who let frustration dictate your judgment. Beatings were one of the most straightforward means of maintaining order. Say a prisoner got mouthy or refused to follow directions. A few strikes with a rod or the back of your hand sent a loud physical message. It was convenient, quick, and effective at least in the short term. But rougher guards didn't stop there. Some didn't wait for defiance. They punished preemptively, assuming everyone was guilty of something. After all, these men weren't respected soldiers. They were low-ranking, often rough-around-the-edges workers who could throw their weight around without many consequences. Well, at least most of the time. Other forms of punishment were designed to humiliate as much as hurt. The stocks were a popular option. Let's say a prisoner disrespected you openly or acted out in front of witnesses. Public shaming was better than trying to explain yourself with words. You lock them into the wooden contraption, arms and head trapped, and let the townspeople take it from there. Rotten food, rocks, spit, whatever the crowd brought with them became part of the sentence. It was messy and, for the prisoner, degrading, but it served its purpose. Everyone else watching got the message loud and clear. Disobedience wouldn't end behind closed prison doors, it would follow you into the light of day. But what about when a prisoner stepped out of line in ways you couldn't ignore? Say they instigated a riot or attempted an escape. In those cases, guards often took harsher steps. Floggings were common, both a punishment and a warning for others. A whip or cane, could split the skin in ways that left scars and served as lasting reminders. In some cases, the punishment wasn't private. The injured prisoner might be forced to hobble around the prison or back to their cell, where everyone could see what happened. But as effective as these punishments may have seemed, they came with a cost. Go too far, leave a prisoner seriously injured, or even dead, and you might trigger resistance rather than submission. A well-timed strike inspired fear. A poorly timed one inspired rebellion. Some guards, however, tried not to get their hands dirty at all. Instead of dealing out punishments themselves, they manipulated conditions within the prison to maintain control. For example, food portions could be withheld or cut entirely, a quick way to ruin someone's day or suppress an uprising without needing to swing a stick. Cold cells, damp conditions, and isolation could do as much damage mentally as a strike to the back could do physically. Essentially, the guards could use the environment against the prisoners. When the dungeon itself became part of the punishment, the justice system barely had to lift a finger. Still, there was a constant tension for guards between punishment and retaliation. If you were heavy-handed, you might secure order in the moment, but you ran the risk of creating long-term enemies. Desperate prisoners weren't above revenge, especially those with nothing to lose. That's where the danger started to circle back on the guards themselves. More than one guard found themselves ambushed in darkened corners or suddenly overpowered when prisoners worked together. The irony? The very punishments that kept prisoners in their place could be turned against the jailer the moment they miscalculated the mood. Take medieval England, for example. In some smaller prisons, guards relied almost entirely on physical punishments because they lacked the manpower to do much else. It was quicker and often more intimidating than rationing food or dragging prisoners into more elaborate correction methods. But in larger cities, misusing your authority could bring an entirely different kind of trouble. Too much brutality, especially if you left a prisoner visibly scarred or killed, could cause outrage among onlookers, even among the prisoners themselves. After all, even in a dungeon, tight quarters meant loyalists and sympathizers could emerge, the kind who might band together when you least expected it. Punishment also wasn't always one-sided. Some prisoners were outspoken or notably dangerous, harboring political grudges or just violent tendencies. A calculated display of resistance wasn't unheard of. These were the moments when a guard's sense of control came into question. More astute or forgiving guards might try bargaining or managing the prisoner's needs in ways that kept the peace without escalating into outright violence. They'd ration out slightly better portions of food or allow minor privileges to those who cooperated. But this was a double-edged sword. Too passive, and you'd lose respect, becoming laughably ineffective in the eyes of people eager to exploit your kindness. Too strict, and you'd constantly be glancing over your shoulder. Meanwhile, for every guard attempting to navigate this moral tightrope, there were others who crossed boundaries with no second thought. Cruelty wasn't just accidental. For some, it became a way of justifying their own poor circumstances. Low pay, lack of status, and long, grueling shifts turned some guards bitter, and that bitterness could manifest in their treatment of the prisoners. Some used the role as a way to vent frustration, meting out punishment not because it was deserved, but because they could. Corruption played into this, too. Accepting bribes from prisoners' families might keep one inmate safe, but at what cost? Guards like these knew that abusing their power for personal gain often came with strings attached. Strings that could snap on them at any time. And the consequences of going too far? They were rarely predictable. In some cases, a guard who left a prisoner maimed or dead might find himself on trial not for justice, but because that prisoner had influential allies outside the jail walls. One account tells the story of a dungeon in northern Italy where an enraged prisoner strangled their guard with the very chains intended to bind them. The guard, known for his excessive punishments, underestimated how far a desperate man was willing to go. In the dead of night, no amount of authority mattered when the keys changed hands through sheer force. Ultimately, as a guard, you held significant power over the lives of your prisoners, but that power was anything but secure. Each punishment, whether public or private, came with its own set of risks and ripple effects. On a good day, a sharp hand or a well-timed use of the stocks could prevent chaos. But one bad judgment call, say, punishing a prisoner who had allies within the cells or even outside the prison, could end with you being the hunted instead of the hunter. So, while you might stand tall with a whip or a club, the real skill came in knowing when not to wield it. Every punishment carried a cost, and the line between impressing authority and inviting retaliation wasn't a line at all, it was a smudge. The very tools at your disposal could protect you or doom you, depending entirely on how you used them. And that brings us to a question that haunted guards every single day. What happens when someone who has suffered under your watch gets their chance to slip through your fingers? Because no matter how strong the bars or how heavy the locks, prisoners rarely stop looking for an escape route. And when one of them finds it, guess who's the first person to blame? If you were a medieval prison guard, there was one nightmare scenario that loomed over your head every single day. Escape. When a prisoner slipped through the bars, the first question wasn't, how do we catch them? It was, who's to blame? Spoiler, it was probably you. Whether you missed a lock, underestimated a bribe, or just had plain bad luck, prisoner escapes meant someone in power was going to want answers, and those answers almost never worked in the guard's favor. The consequences for letting a prisoner get away were rarely small. At best, you'd face a demotion, loss of pay, or a fine that you'd struggle to pay back on a meager salary. At worst, you'd be punished the way some prisoners were, beaten, shackled, or even thrown into the same cells you used to patrol, left to hope that none of your former charges held a grudge. And yes, this occasionally happened. You let a thief escape? Well, congratulations, now you've got first-hand experience living among the ones who don't. Medieval justice was nothing if not poetic unfair, brutal poetry, but poetry nonetheless. Sometimes the escape itself wasn't your fault. Medieval prisons weren't exactly fortresses of engineering. Locks rusted and stuck, keys bent, and iron bars weakened with age. Prison architecture was often more concerned with keeping people miserable than keeping them inside. Then there was overcrowding, a perennial problem. Cramming cells past capacity wasn't just a question of comfort, it made watching the prisoners harder by sheer numbers. You couldn't be in 6 places at once, and every unchecked corner or unwatched motion was an opportunity for someone to quietly file away at their chains or dig at the mortar around a loose stone. And then there was bribery. Being a guard meant you were constantly blindsided by temptation. Prisoners knew you weren't paid much, and those with outside connections could smuggle in coins, jewels, or favors if it meant softening your resolve. All it took was one gold piece or even a promise of honor to get some guards to look the other way. But here's the catch. Not all bribes stayed simple. Maybe you took the coins one day, pretending not to notice a hole being dug, but what happens when the next prisoner gets curious about your integrity? Word of corruption spreads fast in a place where nothing stays secret for long. Accept one bribe and suddenly, you're stuck on a slippery slope. Refuse the next offer, and someone might rat you out for the deal you already made. And then, of course, there were the jailbreaks that didn't rely on subtlety. We've all heard the stories about dramatic prison escapes, and to be honest, some of them are worth every exaggerated retelling. Take the 15th century escape of Ludovico Vistorini, an Italian noble. Imprisoned in Milan, he managed to flee not by bribing the guards but by conspiring with a friend on the outside, who cut through the bars of his cell using a handsaw made of hardened steel. The prison guard on duty, reportedly a sleep hand, probably regretted it for the rest of his days. Another famous escape, from the Tower of London no less, involved one Alan a Dale, yes, of Robin Hood fame, releasing one of his men dressed as a visitor. The prisoner simply walked out in the clothes of the visitor, while the unfortunate jailer found himself angrily interrogated about how a man in full civilian garb got past without notice. But here's the twist. For every famous, dramatic escape, there were 1,000 smaller, quieter ones. A prisoner slipping into the night under cover of darkness, a guard, distracted by a well-timed diversion. These happened more than anyone liked to admit. And when they did, it was the guards who paid for it, whether they were complicit or not. One English jailer named Roger, his full name never fully survives in the records, oversaw a dungeon in Warwickshire where 3 thieves escaped after melting down their chain locks with acid brought in by visitors. Regardless of how much he protested that he'd personally double-checked the chains before his shift, Roger was stripped of his rank and fined more than he could pay in 3 years. So, with escapes threatening their jobs and their live show, did guards try to prevent them? The first step was vigilance. That meant nightly checks. Guards patrolling at all hours, shining flickering torches into the cells, making sure the prisoners weren't hiding saws, chisels, or other tools under their straw bedding. But that wasn't foolproof. Plenty of escapes happened during the guards' nightly rotations. Small windows of time were all some prisoners needed. Strategic patrols came next. If you worked in a halfway decent prison, you would have been assigned a rotation carefully designed to have you cross paths with another guard at timed intervals. The idea was that, together, your footsteps would keep the prisoners from knowing the rhythm of your patrols. But again, this worked better in theory than in reality. A guard who fell ill, skipped a rotation, or cut corners created cracks in the schedule that prisoners exploited. Worse, in dimly lit corridors, you'd sometimes barely see your backup moving through the shadows. And if they weren't where you thought they'd be, well, you hoped the prisoners didn't notice. Then there were the locks themselves. Many guards were instructed to double lock the doors under their charge huge, clanking mechanisms that required extra time and effort to both lock and unlock. This was supposed to make escape attempts slower and more noticeable. But just as often, those double barriers slowed down the guards themselves when responding to fights, fires, or outbursts. It bought prisoners time by stealing it from the very people meant to control them. Also, prisons being prisons, the double locks often fell victim to the repetitive wear and tear of medieval maintenance, leaving gaps for clever inmates to force them open when no one was watching. Finally, some guards went rogonaut in the corrupt sense, but in the creative sense. They booby-trapped corridors or staircases with small alarms. Simple bells tied to string or pieces of broken tile placed purposefully on the floor could alert them to escape attempts long before a prisoner reached the gate. These extra measures boosted their sense of control and helped offset the anxiety of being outnumbered, but even they weren't reliable. Medieval prisons weren't perfectly secure environments. Even the smallest weaknesses could be exploited by a desperate, clever inmate. What sucks most about medieval prison escapes is how much of the blame ended up on the shoulders of men who weren't entirely at fault. Sure, a guard caught napping would likely deserve what he got, but plenty of guards operated under genuinely impossible conditions: rusted locks, overcrowded cells, compromised walls. When something went wrong, anything from a missing shackle to a missing person, the system didn't offer much sympathy. The guard who failed to prevent it faced humiliation and punishment, not just from their leaders but sometimes from their own prisoners, especially those left behind, eager to make the next attempt even easier. Ultimately, being a guard wasn't just about power. It was about surviving under a constant shadow of fear. Your reputation depended entirely on your ability to keep people you couldn't trust, locked in a space you couldn't control. And the second that delicate balance tipped against you, every bit of authority you held could vanish like the footsteps of an escaped prisoner fading into the night. So, if the risk was this high, what did guards get in return? With the weight of life and death hanging on their every move, surely there was at least some reward for taking all this on, right? If this was your job, you'd hope the pay made it worth the effort. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Forget visions of wealth, prestige, or straightforward rewards. Being a medieval prison guard wasn't a career people pursued for the salary or perks, assuming you could even call them that. The truth is, the compensation was as meager as the risks were plentiful. And even in a time where money didn't stretch far for most people, the earnings of a jailer often made raising a family a struggle. You weren't working for glory. You were working because there was no alternative, because the job found you when no one else wanted it. Let's talk numbers. Depending on the region and era, a medieval guard might receive wages comparable to a farm labourer or a low-ranking soldier. In England, for example, a jailer in the 14th century could earn about a few pence a day, barely enough to keep food on the table for a family or afford even the most basic comforts. And that was if they were paid at all. Late payments, underpayment, or outright corruption among officials in charge of distributing wages was as much a part of the job as patrolling the prison corridors. You were often left chasing what you were owed, sometimes for weeks or months after a shift was over. In extreme cases, guards resorted to working second jobs or depending on handouts to avoid joining the very prisoners they were keeping watch over. But here's the insult to injury. The expectations placed on you were massive. You weren't just a gatekeeper simply unlocking and locking doors, as you know by now. You were responsible for monitoring cells, preventing altercations, feeding the prisoners, sometimes administering punishment, and maintaining the basic order of an environment designed to fall apart. And all of that was supposed to be done with calm authority while knowing you could be held personally responsible for any mistakes or worse, punished for them. Your pay didn't reflect the stress of the job, yet one wrong move and you'd find yourself answering to angry superiors or facing fines that matched, or exceeded, your entire paycheck. The disparity between the danger guards faced and the lack of compensation didn't go unnoticed. In fact, it created a culture of desperation and corruption within many medieval prisons. Guards often turned to bribes as a way to pad their meager income or just make ends meet. It wasn't exactly a secret either. Prisoners with money or outside connections quickly learned that a well-placed coin could buy some surprising leniency. Need someone to overlook an infraction? slip them a coin or two. Essentially, a jailer's authority became something you could rent for the right price. And while this probably made some guards' lives more bearable in the short term, it came with its own risks. Once you got a reputation for accepting bribes, you became vulnerable not just to blackmail from prisoners, but to suspicion from your fellow guards or superiors. The system turned guards against each other almost as much as it put them against the prisoners. Now, does this mean all guards succumbed to corruption? Not exactly. Some managed to scrape by on the official wages barely. Others might have supplemented their income in less obvious ways, like taking confiscated property from prisoners and selling it elsewhere. And some, out of pure loyalty to the role or hope for promotions that rarely came, tried to do everything by the book despite the near impossible odds. But you can imagine how sitting in the same cell block day after day, underpaid and overworked, would wear anyone down. Bribe culture started less from a place of greed and more from necessity. The system didn't pay guards enough to live, and everyone from prisoners to higher-ranking officials knew it. The lack of pay wasn't just a slap in the face, it set the tone for how prison guards were viewed by the rest of society. The job didn't come with prestige or honor. Guards were seen as a necessary evil, low on the social ladder, with little respect attached to their role. The association with dungeons, those dark, grim spaces of filth and agony, meant people viewed guards as complicit in the suffering they oversaw. You weren't keeping the peace, no matter how you saw it. To others, you were simply managing misery, an interchangeable cog in a machine of punishment. And unlike knights or soldiers, your work didn't earn you glory in battle or the admiration of communities. You were more likely to be ignored, unless, of course, something went wrong, in which case the blame landed squarely on your shoulders. Even within the ranks of guards, respect wasn't guaranteed. It's not hard to see why the job attracted a wide variety of people, many of whom took it simply because other options were worse or non-existent. Ex-soldiers might take up the role after the battlefield, drawn to the familiarity of authority and routine, but finding themselves bitter with how little they had to show for it. Peasants without land or labor prospects saw it as a last resort, possibly even a step up from serfdom, though how much of a step up this truly was is debatable, given the working conditions. It wasn't uncommon for guards to be looked down upon not only by society but by other positions of power. Essentially, you were the bottom rung in a hierarchical system that offered no chance to climb any higher. For some, though, the job offered one small perk: security. In a time when poverty could spell disaster for entire families, an official post, even one as grueling as a prison guard, provided a rare sense of stability. You weren't going to be rich, but for a while, you might keep your head above water. That is, of course, if nothing went wrong. Those rare few who managed to avoid accusations of corruption, retaliation from prisoners, and outright disease might keep their position long enough to retire. But the rewards for longevity weren't impressive either. Life spent in dungeons left scars no pension could soften. The disconnect between the low pay and high expectations was never more obvious than in moments of crisis. When prisoners rioted, orchestrated escapes, or attacked guards, you weren't just the enforcer, you were the scapegoat. It didn't matter what led to the failure, or whether it could have been prevented. Officials and lords in charge wanted someone to blame, and guards were the easiest targets. Those at the top rarely took responsibility for underfunding prisons or ignoring structural decay. They handed down punishments instead. Knowing you could be fined, demoted, or imprisoned yourself over circumstances outside your control only added to the already crushing weight of the job. So, was it worth it? It's hard to say. For most guards, the job wasn't about thriving, it was about surviving. Sure, the money wasn't good, and the prospects for advancement were worse. But if you had a family to support or no other skills to fall back on, the job at least kept you afloat long enough to see another day. And for some, simply surviving the job felt like its own kind of accomplishment. Making it through years, even just months of patrolling bleak dungeons without meeting some grim fate, was no small feat. Still, it raises the question, who willingly signed up for this life? If the work was so thankless and the risks so high, why were there always more guards filling in the ranks? Was it desperation? A misplaced sense of duty? Or maybe the faint hope that, one day, the role might offer something better? Whatever drew people to the job, one thing was certain: the burdens they carried far outweighed the coins they earned. What kind of person would be willing and able to step into shoes that seemed guaranteed to wear thin? So, who in their right mind would take a job that puts them in the middle of fading torchlight, chains rattling in the background, and the unmistakable stench of human misery all around? The answer is surprisingly simple: people who didn't have much of a choice. Life as a medieval prison guard wasn't something most people aspired to. It was the kind of job you ended up in when the alternatives were even worse. Farmers struggling to keep their land, ex-soldiers unable to return to battle, and men at the bottom of society's ladder all found their way to this profession because, frankly, it was one of the few options available. For some guards, the job represented the next logical step in their careers, at least that's how they justified it. Take an ex-soldier, for example. After years in the chaos of war, a post at a prison could seem relatively stable. You weren't out in the open field dodging arrows or clashing swords, and you technically had a roof over your head, however damp and crumbling it might be. These men already knew discipline and violence, making them valuable hires for prison work. Their battlefield experience meant they had an advantage when it came to controlling unruly prisoners or intimidating them into line. But let's not over-glamorize it. Many soldiers took these positions not because they wanted them, but because the wounds of war, literal or mental, left them unfit for more prestigious roles. Injured, displaced, or otherwise unable to maintain a military career, they often found themselves tossed into this grim substitute with little fanfare and no ceremony. And then there were the men who simply needed steady work desperation. Plain and simple. Picture this. You're a young farmer who's just lost what little land your family had after a bad harvest, or a landlord raising rents. You can't feed your family, let alone yourself, and the thought of begging in the streets is one you'd rather not entertain. Someone tells you there's work at the local dungeon, not glamorous, but it pays. It's not like you have options lined up. So, you take it, knowing full well that the rats and disease will become your daily companions. The irony is, people in this group often stayed longer than they thought they would not because they liked the work, but because the routine at least kept bread on the table. Physical strength also played a role in recruitment. In the medieval mind, brute force was a key ingredient in maintaining order. If you walked into the hiring office, or, let's be honest, the castle kitchen where positions were handed out, with broad shoulders and calloused hands, you might have landed the job purely because you looked like someone capable of breaking up a fight. Sure, that same strength could also make you a target if prisoners ever decided you were their biggest competition, but appearances mattered. Smaller or weaker guards weren't unheard of, but there's no denying that intimidation through sheer size carried weight in a dungeon full of desperate men. But it wasn't all about strength. Sometimes, desperation outweighed physical fitness, and people far from ideal were pushed into this life. Older men nearing the end of their working years, servants who'd fallen out of favor, or even those with minor disabilities, would sometimes end up in these roles. Why? Because the job's requirements weren't particularly high, apart from showing up and surviving. The lords and officials running the prisons weren't looking for excellence, they were looking for bodies to manage the chaos. One of the more fascinating examples comes from records in 14th century France, detailing guards who were actually former prisoners themselves. Dubbed turnkeys, these individuals earned their freedom by agreeing to work for the prison, effectively switching sides. You can imagine the tension this created. Prisoners might respect a turnkey for once being one of them, but they also knew they couldn't trust someone who crossed the line. Guards, meanwhile, rarely trusted these recruits, always wondering if they'd switch back to aiding escape plots when it suited them. Needless to say, the dynamic was tense, and the turnover rate for these turnkeys wasn't exactly stellar. Psychologically, the job took a toll on everyone whether you started out strong-willed or already resigned to misery. You were essentially submerged in an environment designed to break the human spirit. It wore on you. The damp, disease-ridden air got into your lungs. The cries, curses, and occasional silence filled your nights. Some guards tried to cope by detaching themselves entirely. They became cold, mechanical, going through the motions without letting the prisoners' suffering affect them. Others went to the opposite extreme, throwing themselves into punishment and authority as a way to assert control. Everyone dealt with it differently, but eventually, the misery wore through whatever armor you put up. There's one account from medieval England about a guard named Thomas, a mid-level keeper in a small coastal dungeon. Thomas had no background in soldiery. Instead, he'd grown up collecting tolls at a bridge. How he ended up at the prison isn't entirely clear, but records show he was fiercely loyal until he wasn't. Over time, Thomas became infamous among his peers for stealing small portions of food meant for the prisoners and selling the scraps for extra cash. When asked why by his colleagues, he apparently replied, "The rats take more than I do. At least I walk upright while doing it." Here was a man underpaid, overworked, and morally cornered, his choices distilling down to survival, in its purest, bleakest form. Of course, not all guards spiraled like Thomas. Some maintained their composure, tried to be fair, maybe even earned the respect of prisoners. These were rare people, the kind who survived by being sharp enough to avoid manipulation and empathetic enough to avoid hatred. It wasn't an easy balance, though. The wrong move, one act of leniency taken, or a punishment witnessed by too many, could break the fragile relationship between guard and prisoner, putting even the well-meaning ones at incredible risk. Women occasionally popped up in these roles, though far less frequently. In family-run prisons or smaller setups, wives of male guards might take on unofficial duties, ensuring prisoners were fed or helping their husbands patrol. It wasn't glamour-rousing, it certainly wasn't safe. A mid-12th century account from Germany notes a Matilda, keeper of the keys, which, judging by context, was less about her title and more about necessity. When her husband fell ill, Matilda essentially ran the prison herself for several weeks. While it's unclear how the prisoners responded, the account notes she called on the men of the village to strike fear into the inmates. Whether that fear held or not is anyone's guess. Even so, what united most guards was their ordinariness. They weren't elites, warriors, or charismatic leaders. They were farmers, wounded soldiers, or desperate tradesmen shoved into extraordinary circumstances. Their physical strength and survival instincts created barriers to the chaos, but their humanity often blurred the lines between enforcer and victim. At the end of the day, most guards just wanted to survive the prison as much as the prisoners inside did. But there's one area where survival tested even the most hard-headed of jailers: nighttime. When the torches burned low and the inmates grew oddly silent, the job didn't pause. Guards had to master the art of sleeping without really sleeping, staying one ear open for the faintest shuffle of chains or whisper of an escape. Because in a medieval dungeon, danger didn't sleep, even when you tried to. And the night watch? That's when the stakes felt higher than ever. The torches in the corridor are burning low now, their flickering light barely holding back the shadows creeping along the damp stone walls. By this time of night, your body feels as heavy as your set of keys, but closing your eyes completely, that's a mistake you'll never make twice. Because even in your sleep, you're listening strung tight for the smallest noise, a chain dragging across the floor, the creak of shifting boards, or a whispered voice plotting something you can't yet see. This is the night watch, and it's less about resting and more about surviving the hours when darkness gives prisoners their most dangerous ally. Managing the night shift wasn't a simple task. Prisoners didn't stop being prisoners just because the sun went down, and the dungeon didn't suddenly become safer either. Guards, stretched thin during the day, were even fewer at night. You patrolled the cold, uneven floors, squinting into cell windows with your torch held high, watching the flames dance against rows of iron bars. But staring into those dimly lit cells wasn't reassuring. Shadows played tricks on your eyes. You couldn't always tell if that shape in the corner was just straw from a prisoner's bedding or someone quietly working away at a loose stone in the wall. Every few hours, you'd stop to listen. Not just with your ears, but with every nerve in your body. The eerie silence of the dungeon could be worse than the noise. It wasn't the calm of a peaceful world, it was the quiet before chaos. Prisoners who spent all day shouting or banging on their doors didn't suddenly fall asleep just because it was dark. They were watching you, waiting for your route to become predictable, or hoping exhaustion would drag you into complacency. And when you walked those same routes at the same times, they'd commit your movements to memory. That's when they'd strike just as your confidence, or your fatigue, lulled you into feeling safe. The tools at your disposal during night shifts were rudimentary at best. Your torch, though reliable for light, wasn't exactly comforting when the flame flickered or guttered out with no warning, leaving you in a thick, suffocating dark until you managed to relight it. Some guards tied bells to cell doors or gates, rigging them to jangle if moved. In some cases, even small piles of loose stones laid outside of cell entrances worked as crude alarms. If someone tried sneaking out, they'd knock into the mess, the sound reverberating through the stone halls. Guards lucky enough to have dogs stationed with them used the animals as living alarms, trained not to bark constantly but to growl or stiffen at subtle signs of movement and, on occasion, to attack. But not every dungeon had the resources or cared enough to provide such tools. Most of the time, it came down to your instincts and your ability to stay awake when everything in your body begged otherwise. And let's be honest, staying awake wasn't always easy. Guards worked long, punishing shifts, juggling the monotony of watching over sleeping gore, pretending to sleep prisoners with bone-deep exhaustion. Some nights were uneventful, and those were the worst. That creeping boredom would settle over you like a heavy cloak, your eyes stinging, your head nodding until you caught it at the last second. The dungeon itself seemed to conspire against you. The dark didn't just hide prisoners plotting their next breakout. It also muffled the quiet sounds meant to keep you alert. The occasional drip of water from the ceiling or the shuffling of rats might startle you at first, but after hours of hearing the same noises, even those faded into the background, easy to tune out when fatigue set in. Falling asleep on the job, though, that wasn't something you walked away from easily. There's a documented story of a 13th century jailer in Lyon who dozed off during his watch, his keys dangling too close to a clever prisoner who'd spent weeks fashioning a crude hook from bits of broken iron. The prisoner slipped those keys through the bars and vanished into the night. The guard woke up too late, confused and disoriented, only to be confronted by his furious superiors hours later. His punishment? Public flogging and eventual imprisonment in the very cell the escapee had vacated. Sleeping while on duty didn't just risk your job, it risked everything you had, including your freedom. On the flip side, too much vigilance could feel just as draining. Some guards developed their own methods for staying awake, like pacing endlessly up and down the corridor to keep their blood moving or rubbing dirt into their eyes to sting themselves awake. Others resorted to desperate measures like jabbing small cuts into their arms or biting the inside of their cheeks, but no amount of vigilance guaranteed results. Guards staying awake never stopped prisoners from trying. They just delayed success for those committed to escaping. Whether it was using the spoon they hid at dinner to scrape away at a rotting section of wood, or whispering plans to their cellmates during the quieter hours, inmates rarely wasted the night. You could feel it, that tension hanging in the dark, a constant reminder that while the prisoners might be locked away, the danger wasn't. Then there were the noises that did signal danger, real danger. A shout cutting through the silence, followed by scuffling feet, a cell door creaking too loudly, as if tested just that bit too far. These moments sent adrenaline racing through guards who'd spent hours trying not to lose focus. The problem is, adrenaline doesn't tell you what you're running into. Maybe it's just some mind-gamey prisoner choosing to bang on pipes for attention. Or maybe it's something much worse. Prisoners working together to overpower the guard, who checks on what they assume is just a harmless distraction. To make things more complicated, the unexpected thrived in these hours. Night dungeons weren't just quiet, they were isolated. If something happened, if you got attacked or found yourself cornered, you couldn't simply shout for help. You had to rely on your own ability to get out of the situation alive. Some guards carried small whistles, meant to signal the odd distant colleague, but even those weren't foolproof. And if you did manage to alert someone else, it might take time for another guard to arrive, time you probably didn't have. There's a sharp irony here. Being physically strong or armed with the biggest club didn't matter during the night shift as much as one specific skill: staying alert. Alertness wasn't glamorous, and it didn't guarantee survival, but it separated guards who lasted from those who didn't. Because the moment you grew comfortable, the moment you thought, "It's been quiet for hours, I can rest my eyes for just a minute," you became every inmate's ultimate target. They didn't need to outfight you, they just needed to outweight you. Still, no amount of training or preparation made night watch feel normal. The dungeon hummed with a kind of foreboding energy, whether it was imaginary or otherwise. Even after years of patrolling, guards never truly felt at ease during these hours. You'd hear stories of colleagues claiming they saw figures moving in the dark or footsteps that didn't belong to any prisoner. The mind started playing tricks, feeding into the unease already pulsing beneath your exhaustion. The prisoners listened too. They heard your footsteps falter as you passed by. They noticed the small tremor in your voice when you called for silence. And by morning, whatever calm you'd fought to enforce during the night slipped through gaps in the dungeon, just like the torch smoke curling against the damp walls. When all was said and done, the night watch wasn't just about keeping prisoners from escaping or fighting. It was about getting through the night yourself, intact and awake, without becoming the lightest sleeper in the room. So you'd tuck the keys tightly into your belt, grip your torch as though it might suddenly flicker out, and wait and listen. Because if the prisoners didn't make it through the night, whether by illness, violence, or sheer collapse, the mess would be left for you to clean up. But speaking of prisoners who didn't survive until daylight, that's a whole story of its own. In the medieval prison, death wasn't a possibility, it was a certainty. If you worked as a guard long enough, you'd encounter it in all its grim varieties. Sometimes you saw it coming, slowly creeping up on a prisoner weakened by starvation or disease. Other times, it came without warning, a brawl gone too far, a suicide in the dead of night, or even an execution that went worse than planned. However it happened, one reality remained the same. Managing a dead or dying body was another part of your endless list of thankless duties. Death had its patterns in a place like this. The most predictable cause, of course, was disease. The medieval dungeon was a textbook lesson in how rapidly illness could spread rat-infested, airless, dank, and packed with way too many bodies. All that close proximity meant one prisoner coughing in the corner on Monday could become a dozen prisoners feverish by Friday. Dysentery made its rounds frequently, leaving cells slippery with filth and inmates too weak to sit up, let alone rebel. The plague was another regular visitor, carried by fleas or rats and ushering in death with terrifying efficiency. Prisoners knew that sharing a cell with a sick man was practically a death sentence, but what choice did they have? And you, as a guard, weren't much safer. It didn't matter if you stood outside the bars or wore a scarf over your face, there wasn't a lot of distance between you and the infected. Sometimes, disease arrived without warning. One moment, the prisoner you're feeding seems to just be lying there, quiet for the first time in days. The next, you hear the groaning and see the telltale signs, the sweat, the dullness in their eyes, the shaking limbs. At that point, all you could do was wait. Not out of cruelty, but because medieval prisons didn't exactly come with a doctor on standby. Medical care wasn't something budgeted for, and even if it was, what could medieval medicine have done? Bloodletting? Leeches? Prayers? None of it would have made a difference when diagnosed inside a place where death could practically be sniffed out from the hallway. Yet, it wasn't only disease that claimed prisoners. Violence was another brutal, unrelenting cause. Guards had to keep a close watch for fights that seemed to break out over nothing, a crust of bread, a leaky corner of the cell that was ever so slightly warmer than the rest. Inmates rarely fought cleanly, either. They clawed, smashed heads into walls, or used sharpened bits of scrap as improvised weapons. If things got out of hand, someone was going to die, and by the time you made it inside the cell to break it up, you'd likely find one prisoner slumped over while the rest stared at the floor, no one willing to talk about what just happened. You'd haul the body out, but good luck figuring out who was to blame. And even if you thought you knew, punishment meant nothing to dead men or those still alive and smirking at your helplessness. Then there were suicides. For prisoners facing something like execution or even just the crushing reality of life in a medieval dungeon, some took matters into their own hands. Hanging was the most common method, with inmates twisting bits of their clothing or bedding into makeshift nooses. Guards would discover them during patrols, their body weight turning the fabric into knots that would be almost impossible to untie. Tumbling them down from a beam or hook was no less of a task, and once they were on the ground, what then? You might log their name and sentence if they hadn't already faded into anonymity, but where the body went depended entirely on the prison. Removing the deceased wasn't straightforward, either. Some prisons employed gravediggers or lower-level staff meant specifically to deal with the bodies, but in smaller operations, that responsibility often fell to the guards themselves, likely the worst part of your shift. Dragging corpses through narrow, slippery corridors or up steep, winding stairs wasn't something anyone could do without feeling the weight of it literally and figuratively. Cells rarely allowed for stretchers or dignified removals, so you'd often haul prisoners out by their limbs, trying your best not to drop them. Some didn't even make it out whole. Prisoners who died of disease were often decomposing just enough that body parts might dislodge during the process, another grim detail you didn't get paid enough to deal with. The final destination for these bodies varied. Wealthier prisons might have special pits outside their wall-mass graves for those deemed unworthy of proper burials. In smaller, local jails, prisoners might be dumped in shallow graves behind the building, quickly and with little ceremony. And then there were the makeshift solutions. There are accounts of some medieval guards tossing bodies into rivers or out-of-sight locations just to get rid of them quickly, their decay attracting scavengers while townsfolk wrinkled their noses but didn't ask too many questions. The message was clear. Once you were dead, you weren't the prison's problem anymore. One of the most harrowing accounts comes from 15th century England, where a prison in York hit its breaking point during an outbreak of the sweating sickness. Overcrowded cells, already brimming with disease, saw over a dozen deaths in a single week. The guards, overwhelmed and understaffed, resorted to dragging bodies out at night to avoid notice, pulling them by ropes tied to their ankles and throwing them into pits dug hastily by the prison's perimeter. The guards themselves didn't escape fate. 3 fell ill and joined their own burial piles by the month's end. Yet for guards, The physical toll of managing death wasn't the heaviest burden, it was the mental weight. You weren't just watching prisoners die, you were surrounded by it, day in and day out. The dungeon reeked of it. The flies buzzing near certain cells became an early indicator of who wouldn't make it through the night. And those experiences, the sick prisoners begging for medicine, the dying ones convulsing on the floor as you kept your distance, the stony silence of bodies being dragged away, stayed with you long after your shift ended. If you had nightmares, there was no one to tell. You were expected to get over it, to be hard. Because if the prisoners saw you struggle, even for a second, they'd pounce on it, reinforcing their belief that you were more like them than you wanted to admit. Some guards tried hardening themselves emotionally to cope with the relentless exposure to death. They'd joke about it, turning bodies into a punchline or treating them as objects to avoid thinking of them as people. Others clung to routines, immersing themselves in patrol schedules and logbooks, as if sheer busyness could block out the smell of rot. And inevitably, there were those who grew resentful of the prisoners, the authorities above them, and even themselves. This bitterness could boil over violently, fueling acts of cruelty as a way to hit back at a system that left both guards and prisoners to rot in different ways. For every prisoner hanging in their cell, there was probably a guard whose spirit hung just a little lower. The thing about death in a medieval prison was that it wasn't just part of the job, it was proof of the job's futility. Guards could patrol every hour, triple lock every cell, ration every crumb of food, and still, death would find its way inside. It crept through the cracks in the stones and hung in the stagnant air. Some guards embraced this reality, others bent under its weight, but ignoring it wasn't an option. Every shift carried the understanding that death was coming, and the best you could do was clean up after it. So, handling death wasn't dramatic or poetic. For the guards it was drudgery, a part of the daily grind akin to feeding prisoners or tightening locks. Like everything else a guard did, it was thankless, unrelenting, and mandatory. And with every body you dragged away, every name you scratched onto a parchment, you were reminded just how temporary your control really was. Inside those walls, no one or not the prisoners, not the guards was untouchable. So, standing there in the corridor after yet another lifeless body has been pulled from a cell, you probably stopped to ask yourself, was any of this worth it? What was this life of endless death, violence, and constant fear supposed to mean? Well, that's the verdict we're left to make. Life as a medieval prison guard wasn't grand, heroic, or even secure. It was a daily grind where the smallest mistake could tear the fragile balance between authority and chaos. You had power, yes, but survival meant knowing how to wield it without turning every prisoner into an enemy or worse, turning yourself into one. Next time you think of history's heroes, spare a thought for the ones who kept the keys. Their work wasn't glamorous, but it was vital in ways we rarely remember. And if you enjoy uncovering hidden corners of history, stick around, there's so much more to explore.